The music was a thin, silver wire, pulled taut across the noise of the ballroom. Verity felt it more than she heard it, a vibration against her teeth. From her alcove behind a wilting potted palm, she was a creature of the shadows, a necessary but unacknowledged part of the evening Oz machinery. Her cousin, Charlotte, was a vision in silk the color of a summer dawn, holding court near the French doors. Her other cousin, Beatrice, was a sharper, colder beauty in sapphire blue, her laughter a series of bright, brittle chimes. Verity was in gray, a useful, unassuming gray, the color of dust and duty. She was a poor relation, a fact her Aunt Augusta never allowed anyone, least of all Verity, to forget. She was at Blackmore, the formidable seat of Duke Crispin, not as a guest to be courted, but as a functionary to be used. Her purpose tonight was to be invisible, to watch for sagging hems, wilting dowagers, and any other minor social catastrophe that might mar her cousin's chances. She had already re-stitched a pearl button onto Beatrice's glove, and assured a flustered footman that yes, the musicians from the village were to be paid in coin, not merely in leftover champagne. Her fingers, still faintly marked with ink from balancing her Inkley's household accounts that morning, smoothed the drab fabric of her own gown. It was a hand-me-down, altered to fit, serviceable, and utterly devoid of charm. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford, her aunt had once said, snipping a thread from a tapestry. Verity had learned the lesson well. She kept her opinions, like her good gloves, for private moments that rarely came. She watched the Duke. It was impossible not to. Duke Crispin moved through his own ballroom like a panther navigating a cage of canaries. He was all sharp lines and controlled force, his black evening coat a stark slash against the pastel frivolity of the room. He was younger than the title suggested, perhaps 30, but his eyes were ancient with a grief that had become the architecture of his face. He had inherited the dukedom and its vast, neglected responsibilities as a boy, after his parents were lost in a sailing accident. The county whispered that the tragedy had frozen something in him, leaving a man made of duty, ice, and impeccable tailoring. He smiled little, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. He noticed things. Verity, a student of the overlooked, recognized a fellow observer. He noticed the tremor in an old man's hand as he reached for a glass. He noticed a débutante's fan fluttering a shade too fast, a sign of panic, and with a quiet word to his steward, had her suffocating mother steered away. He noticed everything except, it seemed, the desperate, hopeful angling of every unmarried woman in the room, her cousins included. Her uncle Ashworth, a man whose ambition had long outstripped his means, was in conversation with the Duke and another gentleman near the fireplace. The third man was stout, with a face that seemed perpetually florid with self-importance. Verity recognized him as Mr. Ellsworth, the uncle of the Duke's young ward. She saw her uncle gesture vaguely in her direction. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She was about to be offered up for some purpose, like a plate of unwanted sandwiches. She tried to shrink further behind the palm, to merge with the wallpaper, but the Duke's gaze followed her uncle's gesture. It was not a glance, it was an assessment, swift and cold as a winter blade. His eyes swept over her gray dress, her plain hair, her posture of quiet servitude. It took no more than a second. Then he turned back to the men. His voice was low, but in a sudden lull in the music, the words carried across the marble floor with perfect cutting clarity. She is not worth a second look. The sentence was not for her. It was a dismissal, a casual closing of a door, but it struck her with the force of a physical blow. The air left her lungs, the silver wire of the violin snapped. For a moment, the entire glittering room, the candlelight, the silks, the laughter wavered and went gray, the color of her dress, the color of her life. She felt the hot, prickling shame rise up her neck, a blush she refused to allow onto her cheeks. She held herself perfectly still, a statue of a poor relation, her head high, her hands clasped at her waist. "She is not worth a second look." The words echoed, stripped of their context, becoming a pronouncement on her very existence. It was not a cruelty, she told herself. It was a fact, as plain and solid as the stone beneath her feet. It was what her aunt's charity, her cousin's pity, and her own mirror had been telling her for years. To hear it from him, the remote, powerful Duke, was merely to have it confirmed by the highest possible authority. She did not flee. There was nowhere to go. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath and forced her gaze away from the group by the fire. She found the youngest footman, a boy of no more than 16, looking lost and overwhelmed near the kitchens. She crossed the floor, her movements calm and measured, and quietly asked if he needed a hand carrying the tray of fresh glasses. The boy's look of gratitude was a small, warm thing in the vast, cold room. It was not a ducasse regard, but it was something, it was real, and for now, it would have to be enough. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, and grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. He had spoken the words as a shield, a reflexive dismissal of something he had not expected to feel. In that single sweeping glance, he had seen not a gray mouse, but a woman standing apart from the desperate fray, her gaze clear and intelligent, a quiet dignity in her stillness. He had seen her, and the seeing of her felt like a risk he could not afford. So, he had lied. To Ellsworth, to Ashworth, and most of all, to himself. It was a lie that would cost him more than he could possibly imagine. The next afternoon, the Ashworth household was thrown into a state of flustered panic by the arrival of the ducal carriage. It stood before their far more modest townhouse, like a black iron exclamation point, the ducal crest on the door glinting in the watery sunlight. Aunt Augusta was certain it was for Beatrice. Beatrice was certain. It was a formal invitation of some kind. Charlotte was already planning what she would wear. When the footman announced that His Grace the Duke of Blackmore was calling for Miss Verity, a stunned silence fell upon the drawing-room. 3 pairs of eyes swiveled to her where she sat mending a tear in a lace curtain. Verity's heart gave a single painful thud. She set down her needle with deliberate care. There must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Duke Crispin was shown into the room, and his presence seemed to diminish it. His height, and the stark authority he wore like a coat, making the chintz chairs and faded rugs look shabby and small. He gave a curt, correct bow to her aunt and cousins, his gaze sweeping past them as if they were furniture, before it landed on Verity. "A Miss Verity," he said. "It was not a question. I require a word with you." In private, Aunt Augusta began to protest. But the Duca's quiet command was absolute. Verity led him to her uncle's study, a small, cramped room that smelled of dust and old paper. It was the only place she felt any sense of peace in this house, and she resented his intrusion into it. He closed the door behind them. The small space crackled with a tension she could not name. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "A Mr. Ellsworth campaigned to gain custody of my ward. Leo has become more aggressive," he stated, his voice as flat and cold as it had been the night before. "He petitions the magistrate on the grounds of my supposed neglect. He suggests the boy needs a softer, more maternal influence, and that my household lacks one. Verity said nothing. She waited. He proposed you, last night, as a potential governess. A suggestion I dismissed. He had the grace not to look away as he said it. I have since reconsidered. The preliminary hearing is in a week. It would be advantageous for Leo to have a female companion established in the household before then. Someone respectable, someone quiet, someone not worth a second look." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. He was offering her a position born of cynical strategy. He needed a prop, a piece of stage dressing for his legal battle, and she, the poor, gray relation, was perfectly cast. A week ago, she would have accepted with quiet, desperate gratitude. It was a position, a salary, an escape from her aunt's suffocating charity. But the raw humiliation of his words the night before had burned something away in her, leaving behind a hard, clear resolve. She met his gaze directly. A no. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a dropped stone. Shock flickered in the Duca's cold eyes. It was clear he was a man who did not often hear that word. I beg your pardon. I said no, Your Grace. She kept her voice, even her hands clasped loosely in front of her. I will not be a prop. I will not be hired as a piece of advantageous window dressing to be presented to a magistrate. He stared at her, a muscle tightening in his jaw. This was not the timid mouse he had assessed and dismissed. This was someone else, entirely. He had come here, expecting to conduct a simple, cold transaction. He found himself in a negotiation he had not anticipated. The position comes with a generous salary, he said, his tone clipped, and my protection. You would be free of EAD, the CAC gestured vaguely, encompassing the small room, the entire house of charity. My freedom is not for sale, Your Grace. And my dignity, what little I am permitted, is not a commodity to be traded for your convenience. It was the bravest thing she had ever said aloud. The words felt strange and powerful in her mouth. She saw something shift in his face. It was not anger. It was a dawning, grudging respect. He was looking at her now, truly looking, and she could feel the weight of his focused, intelligent attention. A what, then? He asked, his voice losing some of its aristocratic frost. What are your terms? The question hung in the air. He was giving her the power she had never had. She took a breath, her mind racing. This was her one chance. Not for revenge, but for self-preservation. If I am to consider this, she began, her voice gaining strength. It will not be as a temporary solution. I will not be dismissed the moment your legal troubles are resolved. I will have full authority over the nursery and my own schedule. The boy, Leo, is not to be used as a pawn by either you or Mr. Ellsworth. His welfare must be the only priority, not the appearance of it. She paused, watching his face. He was listening, intently. And one more thing, she said, her voice dropping slightly. You will tell me the truth, all of it about the ward, his inheritance, and why Mr. Ellsworth is so determined to take him from you. I will not walk into a war, blindfolded. She had done it. She had laid her heart bare, her plain moral courage on display. She expected him to turn on his heel, to leave her to her mending and her invisibility. Instead, Duke Crispin was silent for a long moment. He studied her, his gaze sharp and analytical, but the cold dismissal was gone. He was seeing her now. He was seeing the woman he had tried so hard not to see the night before. Very well, he said at last. The words were quiet, but they resonated with the weight of a signed treaty. Those are my terms as well. The truth. And the boy's welfare, above all else. He extended a hand, not for her to kiss, but to shake. Do we have an agreement, Miss Verity? Her name on his lips sounded different now. Not an afterthought, but a designation. She placed her small, ink-stained hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly steady. We have an agreement, Your Grace. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. He had come to hire a governess. He had found an ally. And as he left her standing in the dusty study, Crispin felt a strange, unwelcome flicker of something he had not felt in a decade. It was not hope. It was something far more dangerous. Curiosity. He had told himself she was not worth a second look, and yet he already knew he would be looking for her, watching her. For every day she remained under his roof. Blackmore from the inside was even more intimidating than it was from without. It was a fortress of grief. The grand halls, meant for light and laughter, were steeped in a heavy, echoing silence. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows, illuminating portraits of grim-faced ancestors. The air was cold, smelling of beeswax and old stone and something else, something like a held breath. The house was waiting for what? Verity did not know. Her reception was as chilly as the marble floors. The housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Gable, looked her over with an expression that clearly communicated she expected Verity to last no longer than her three predecessors, who had fled in tears within a fortnight. The staff were ghosts, moving silently along the walls, their faces shuttered and wary. This was a house that had forgotten how to trust. And then there was the boy. Leo was 10 years old, with a shock of untamable dark hair that mirrored the Duca's, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was not merely silent or sullen, he was a small, contained storm of defiance. When the Duke introduced them in the vast cold library, Leo did not look at her. He stared at a spot on the wall just past her shoulder, his jaw set, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. Leo, this is Miss Verity," the Duke said, his voice strained with an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. She will be staying with us as your companion." Before returning to the wall, "I don't need a companion." Nevertheless," the Duke said, his tone hardening back to its usual frost. She will be here?" He left them alone. It was a test, Verity knew. The Duke, the housekeeper, the house itself, they were all watching to see if she would break. Verity did not try to coax the boy into conversation. She did not ply him with false smiles or cheerful questions. She had been a child like him once, in a way a small, lonely creature in a world of indifferent giants. She knew that forced kindness was a form of violence. Instead, she walked over to the towering windows at the far end of the library. The heavy velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, were drawn tight, shutting out the world. With some effort, she pulled one of them open. Afternoon light, thick with dust, flooded the room, illuminating the rows upon rows of leather-bound books. "A room full of books should never be this dark," she said, more to herself than to him. It is disrespectful to the stories." She did not turn. She ran her hand along a shelf, her fingers tracing the gold-leaf titles. She chose a book at random, a heavy atlas of the world. She carried it to the large library table and sat down, opening it to a map of India, its coastlines traced in intricate detail. She said nothing more. She simply sat there, in the sudden pool of light, and began to read. For an hour, the only sounds were the turning of her pages and the ticking of the grand clock in the hall. Then, she felt a presence beside her. Leo had moved from the wall and was standing by the table, his gaze fixed on the map. He pointed a small, hesitant finger at a city on the coast. My father went there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He brought my mother a shawl made of silk, so fine you could pull it through a ring." Verity looked up, meeting his stormy eyes for the first time. That must be a beautiful memory." As if the word a memoria was a wound, Ada's just a thing that happened. He turned and walked out of the library, his small back ramrod straight. It was not a victory, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the ice. Her days at Blackmore fell into a strange rhythm. She spent her mornings with Leo, mostly in silence, in the light-filled library. She never pushed, she simply existed in his space, reading, mending, or sometimes just looking out the window at the gardens, which were slowly being reclaimed by weeds. In the afternoons, she explored the house. It was a mausoleum, every room a monument to the Ducas, late parents, and more recently, to Loea's, the late Duchess, Crispina's mother, had loved music. The pianoforte was shut and locked. Loea's mother had loved to paint. Her canvases were stacked in a dusty corner of the morning room, turned to the wall. This was not a house that was healing, it was a house that was pickling its grief. The Duke watched her. She would feel his eyes on her from the end of a long corridor, or look up from a book to find him standing in the doorway of the library, his expression unreadable. Their conversations were brief, formal exchanges about Leo's progress, which was minimal, but she noticed he started leaving the library door open when he worked at his desk. He started appearing in the dining room for supper, which Mrs. Gable informed her he had not done in years, preferring to take his meals alone in his study. They were two ghosts haunting the same house, orbiting the small, angry planet of the boy. One evening, she found him in the locked morning room, standing before the stacked canvases. He had one in his hands, a half-finished landscape of the coastline near Blackmore. She was very talented, Verity said softly. From the doorway, he started, not having heard her approach. Leo's mother. Yes, she was. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. I had them put away. I thought it would be easier for the boy. Easier to forget, Verity asked gently. Yes, did it work? He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the boy he must have been. The one crushed under the weight of a premature grief. No. It just made the silence louder. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. Perhaps, Verity said, her heart aching for him, for the boy, for this whole frozen house. The answer is not to forget them. Perhaps it is to make a space for them to be remembered. Nups. Chi. He looked from her to the painting, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him. He did not reply, but the next morning, when she came down for breakfast, the door to the morning room was open, and on an easel, placed in the best light, was the unfinished painting of the coast. Later that week, Mr. Ellsworth came to call. He found Verity and Leo in the gardens, where she was attempting to identify the overgrown herbs in what had once been a flourishing kitchen garden. Ellsworth was all smiles and condescending charm. "Ah, my dear Miss Verity," he boomed, patting Leo on the head. The boy flinched away. "I see you are attempting to bring some order to this wilderness. A noble effort. Much like your efforts with my dear nephew." His eyes held a glint of challenge. We are learning the names of the plants," Verity said calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. This one, I believe, is rosemary, for remembrance," as she met his gaze, and he was the first to look away. He turned his attention to Leo. Your guardian keeps you busy, I see. He works you like a field hand, she is teaching me," Leo said, his voice low and hostile. Not working me." Ellsworth's smile tightened. He had expected a sullen, broken boy he could easily manipulate. He had not expected this flicker of loyalty. He had not expected Verity. That night, Crispin sought her out in the library. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, his face grim. "A Ellsworth petition. My solicitors have sent a copy. He tossed it onto the table. He claims I am unfit, that I am cold, neglectful, that I have isolated the boy in a house of mourning. Are his claims untrue?" Verity asked, quietly, her heart sinking. Crispina's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a defensive fire. "Dada! He has the finest tutors, the best of everything. He has a locked pianoforte, and his mother's paintings turned to the wall," Verity countered, her voice soft but unyielding. He has a guardian who eats alone and a house that holds its breath. He does not need the best of everything, Your Grace. He needs a home." Oh. The truth of her words struck him silent. He sank into a chair, the rigid control of his posture dissolving into a raw human exhaustion. He looked at her, his carefully constructed walls crumbling. Don't it know how," he whispered. "The admission was a surrender. My parents died, and I was given this, the title, the lands, the duties. I was 19. I learned to be a duke. I never learned how to be anything else. When my brother and his wife, when Leo was left with me, I did the only thing I knew how. I managed him as I would an asset of the estate. Men do not always care to be seen." But in that moment, Verity saw him completely not the cold Duke of Blackmore, but a lonely, grieving man, trapped in a role he had never asked for. You are not alone in this now," she said. "It was a promise." He looked at her, his gaze full of a feeling so new and startling it had no name. He had thought he was hiring a governess, a temporary fix, a pawn in his game. He had not expected her to become the one person in the world who saw past the dukedom to the man drowning beneath it. He had not expected to need her. A storm broke that night. A furious tempest that threw rattling sheets of rain against the tall library windows. The wind howled around the corners of the old house like a grieving animal. Verity sat by the fire, unable to sleep the ducas, confession echoing in her mind. A small sound from the doorway made her look up. Leo stood there, a pale, trembling figure in his nightshirt, his eyes wide with fear. "The storm," he whispered. It sounds like the ocean?" The ocean that had taken his parents? Verity's heart clenched. She held out a hand. I know. It is very loud tonight. Would you like to sit with me by the fire until it passes?" He hesitated, then nodded, scurrying over to the armchair opposite hers, and curling into a small ball. For a long time, they sat in silence watching the flames, the only sounds the crackle of the logs and the fury of the storm outside. My mother used to sing when there were storms," Leo said suddenly, his voice muffled by his knees. "Ah, about a rock and being safe." Veritia's mind searched. She knew the old hymns from her own lonely childhood, poring over prayer books in a cold country church. "A rock of Asia," she ventured. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Yes, that one." She began to hum it, her voice soft and low. It was a simple, sturdy melody, a promise of shelter in a world of chaos. She did not have a beautiful voice, but it was steady. After a moment, a tiny, wavering voice joined hers. Leo was humming along, his face still pale, but the terror in his eyes had begun to recede. The library door creaked open. The Duke stood there, his hair disheveled, a dressing gown thrown over his shoulders. He had clearly been woken by the storm as well. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the scene before him, the fire, the frightened boy, and the quiet woman humming a hymn in the heart of the tempest. He did not speak. He simply watched, and in his eyes, Verity saw a profound and startling shift. He was no longer observing a potential ally or a surprising employee. He was watching a woman hold his broken world together, with nothing more than a half-remembered song and a quiet act of kindness. The warmth of the fire seemed to spread through the room, pushing back not just the chill of the night, but the long, cold winter of Blackmore itself. He saw her creating the very thing he had failed to provide, a sanctuary. The next day, the thaw began in earnest. Verity found a box of charcoal sticks and a dusty sketch pad in a forgotten cupboard. She knew, from a passing remark by Mrs. Tays Gable, that Lois' mother had tried to teach him to draw, but that he had not touched a pencil since her death. She did not ask him about it. She simply left the pad and charcoals on the library table, near the open atlas. For 2 days they remained untouched. Then on the third morning, she came into the library to find Leo at the table, his small back bent in concentration, his hand moving swiftly across the page. He was drawing. It was a frantic, almost violent sketch of a ship being tossed on a stormy sea. When he saw her, he quickly covered the page with his arm, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and defiance. Verity did not comment on the drawing. She walked to the window. The sun is out today," she said calmly. The storm has passed." She turned back to him, her expression gentle. "It is good to see you drawing again, Leo." He looked down at his hidden work, and when he looked up again, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. I miss her," he whispered. It was the first time he had said the words aloud to anyone. I know," Verity said, her own throat tight. It is all right to miss her. It is all right to be sad. It is even all right to be angry." He seemed to collapse in on himself, the rigid defiance draining away, leaving a small, heartbroken boy. Later that afternoon, she found a new drawing left on her chair. It was a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a lock of hair falling across her forehead. It was clumsy, the proportions all wrong, but it was rendered with such love that it took Veritia's breath away. Underneath, in a childish, careful script, was the word, Mama. The change in Leo seemed to unlock something in the Duke as well. He began to join them in the library, not just to watch, but to participate. He would read aloud from the boy's favorite adventure stories, his deep voice filling the quiet room. He showed Leo how to navigate by the stars using the old atlas. He told stories of his own boyhood at Blackmore, of climbing the ancient oak tree and fishing for trout in the stream. He was clumsy at it, his manner still stiff and formal. But he was trying. The house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. One evening, as Verity was shelving a book, her hand brushed against his as they both reached for the same volume. A jolt, sharp and unexpected as lightning, passed between them. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He froze, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes dark and intense. The air in the library grew thick, charged with a new and terrifying electricity. "A Verity," he said, his voice husky. She could not speak. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was dangerous territory, a place for which she had no map. He took a step closer. I did not expect this. Nor I, your grace," she managed to whisper. "A Crispin," he corrected her, his voice low. My name is Crispin." It felt like a key turning in a lock. The Duke was a fortress. Crispin was the man inside, a man who was looking at her not with gratitude or respect, but with a raw, undisguised hunger that both thrilled and terrified her. He was seeing her, all of her, and she was no longer sure she could bear the intensity of his gaze. The moment was shattered by the arrival of a footman bearing a letter on a silver tray. It bore the seal of the local magistrate. Crispin took it, his face hardening as he broke the wax. He read the contents, and all the warmth that had begun to seep into his features vanished, replaced by a glacial fury. Ellsworth," he said, his voice tight with rage. He has produced a new document. A letter, supposedly from my late sister-in-law, written a week before her death. Veritia's blood ran cold. What does it say? It names him as her preferred guardian for Leo, should anything happen to her. And my brother? He crumpled the letter in his fist. He claims my brother's will is invalid, that this is her dying wish. The magistrate has called a formal hearing at Blackmore. In 2 days. Is it genuine? Verity breathed. Crispin looked away, his expression tortured. I don't know. The signature looks like hers. The handwriting, it is close. He paced the room like a caged animal. If it is real, if she did not trust me with her own Suna. The old wound, the fear of his own inadequacy, had been ripped open. He is trying to break you, Verity said, her voice ringing with a sudden certainty. He is using your own grief, your own doubts against you. We cannot let him. Crispin stopped his pacing and looked at her. The fear was still in his eyes, but something else was there too, a reliance on her strength, her clarity. In the face of this new assault, he had turned instinctively to her. She had become his anchor in the storm. What do we do? He asked. The question was not from a duke to a governess. It was from a man to his partner. We fight, Verity said, with the truth. But as she looked at the crumpled letter in his hand, a cold dread settled over her. Ellsworth was a clever, patient schemer. The truth was a fragile weapon against a well-crafted lie, and they had only 2 days. The 2 days before the hearing were a blur of tense, desperate activity. Crispin's solicitors arrived from London, filling the library with the scent of expensive wool and the dry rustle of legal documents. They examined the letter, their faces grim. The forgery, if it was one, was expert. The paper was of the correct age, the ink consistent with what Leo's mother had used. Crispin retreated into himself. The nascent warmth that had begun to bloom in him withered under the cold blast of this new threat. He became the Duke of Blackmore again, remote, severe, issuing orders and poring over documents with a feverish intensity. He barely spoke to Verity. his eyes sliding past her as if she were once again a ghost in his house. The fragile bridge they had started to build between them seemed to have been washed away. He had become a man who was afraid. Not of enemies, but of feeling, and of failing the one person whose trust he could not bear to lose, his dead sister-in-law. The possibility that she had not trusted him with her son was a poison, and he was letting it consume him. Verity, shut out from the legal strategy, focused on Leo. The boy was preternaturally aware of the tension in the house. He had grown quiet again, his drawings becoming darker, full of shadows and faceless figures. He clung to Verity's side, his small hand often stealing into hers. A silent plea for reassurance she did not know how to give. She spent her time, not with the solicitors, but in her Inkley's study, a room she now thought of as her own. She had asked Crispin for all the household account books from the past 3 years. He had given them to her without question, a small automatic act of trust in the midst of his own turmoil. She spent hours at the desk, her fingers tracing the columns of figures, her mind sharp and focused. She was not a solicitor, but she was the daughter of a man who had been ruined by bad accounting. She knew her way around a ledger. She was looking for a whisper, a shadow, a single entry that did not belong. Ellsworth, she knew, had been a frequent visitor long before Verity's arrival. He had managed a small outlying portion of the estate on behalf of Leo's parents. The ledgers were meticulous, but as she cross-referenced them with the main Blackmore accounts, she began to see a pattern: small amounts. Payments for repairs to cottages that, according to Crispina's records, had been sound. Requisitions for seed that was never delivered to the tenants. Each transaction was minor, easily overlooked, but taken together over 3 years, they formed a quiet, steady siphoning of funds from the boy's inheritance. Ellsworth had not been waiting to become guardian. He had been robbing the estate in plain sight all along. It was a start, but it did not prove the letter was a forgery. The night before the hearing, she found Leo in the morning room, standing before his mother's unfinished painting. He was holding one of his own drawings, a copy of the landscape, but with a small figure added on the cliff's edge. "I remember when she painted this," he said, his voice thick, as she was happy. She said the sea looked like it was smiling that day. He looked down at the forged letter, which Verity had left on a side table. "She would have sent me away. Not from here. Not from him, Allah." He gestured toward the door, where Crispin was no doubt pacing in the library. Verity's heart ached. "I know, Leo. A Mr. Ellsworth, he never liked her paintings," the boy continued, a small frown creasing his brow. "I said they were a messy. He told her she should paint flowers in a vase. Proper things. Ed." He looked at the letter again. In a letter. He has her say that she hopes I will pursue a neat and orderly life. There it is." Breath caught. It was a small thing, a turn of phrase. It was Ellsworth's voice, not his mother's. "Leo," she said, her voice urgent. "Ah, that is very important. Can you remember anything else?" "Anything," he said. "Anything," she wrote in her real letters. He screwed up his face in concentration. "As she always ended her letters to me, yours in all the world, Mama." Verity snatched up the forged letter. It ended with a formal, correct, with deepest maternal affection. It was enough. It had to be. The hearing was convened in the library. The room had been stripped of its newfound warmth, transformed into a makeshift courtroom. A stern-faced magistrate, Sir Julian Croft, sat behind the great mahogany desk. Crispin and his solicitors sat on one side, a picture of grim, aristocratic defense. On the other sat Mr. Ellsworth, his face a mask of sorrowful concern, his black suit a performance of mourning. Verity and Leo sat slightly apart, near the fireplace. They were exhibits, the living heart of the matter, yet peripheral to the cold, legal arguments. Ellsworth's solicitor presented his case first. He painted a damning picture of a cold, reclusive duke, lost in his own grief, neglecting his young ward in a house of shadows. He spoke of Leo's silence, his isolation. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he produced the letter, a mother's dying wish, Sir Julian. A plea for her son to be raised not by a man who has turned his back on the world, but by her own devoted brother, a man of warmth and feeling. A letter was passed to the magistrate, who read it with a grave expression. The air in the room grew heavy. Verity could feel the case slipping away. Crispin sat like a man carved from ice, his face a mask of impassive misery. He believed he had already lost. Then Crispin's solicitor began his cross-examination. But Ellsworth was prepared. He batted away questions about his motives with practiced ease, professing only his love for his nephew. Finally, Sir Julian looked over at Verity. Miss Verity, you have been in the Duca's employ for what? A month. Just over a month, sir, she replied, her voice clear and steady. Ah, and in that time, what have you observed of the Duca's conduct toward his ward? This was the moment. She could describe the thaw, the stories read by the fire, the atlas open on the table. But she knew that was not where the battle would be won. I have observed a guardian who loves his ward deeply, but who has been like the boy himself, paralyzed by grief, she said. The honesty of it made everyone, including Crispin, look at her. But that is an observation of the heart, sir, not of the law. Perhaps the household accounts would be more to the point. A murmur went through the room. Ellsworth stiffened. At a nod from the magistrate, Verity stepped forward and laid the ledgers on the desk. With calm, clear precision, she pointed out the discrepancies, the small, systematic thefts. She was not emotional. She presented the numbers, the dates, the pattern of deceit. Mr. Ellsworth's concern for his nephew's inheritance seems to be of a very practical personal nature, she concluded quietly. Ellsworth was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Lies. A fabrication by a desperate woman trying to secure her position. The magistrate held up a hand for silence, his expression thoughtful. The evidence is circumstantial, Miss Verity. It suggests a motive, but it does not invalidate the late Mrs. Ashworth's letter. The hope that had flared in the room guttered and died. Crispin slumped slightly in his chair. And then a small, clear voice cut through the silence. It isn't her letter. All eyes turned to Leo. He was standing now, his small body trembling, but his gaze fixed on the magistrate. He had not been asked to speak. He had simply chosen to. Sir Julian, he said, his voice gaining strength. My mother, she loved messy things. She loved the sea when it was wild. And she loved my drawings even when I got charcoal on the carpets. She would never ever have told me to be innate and orderly. He took a step forward, his eyes flashing with a righteous fire that was a perfect echo of his guardian's. And she always signed her letters to me, yours and all the world. Always. That letter is a lie. Mr. Ellsworth is a lie. He wants my money, not me. He turned his back on his uncle and walked, not to the Duke, but to Verity. He slipped his hand into hers, a small, fierce grip. He looked up at her, and then back at the stunned room. Want to stay here with her? With both of them. It was devastating. The simple, unshakable truth, spoken by a child. Ellsworth began to bluster, to object, but the magistrate's face was like stone. The spell was broken. The room no longer believed him. Then Crispin stood. He moved not to the magistrate's desk, but to stand beside Verity and Leo, placing a hand on the boyish shoulder. He looked at Ellsworth, his eyes no longer cold, but blazing with a white-hot protective fury. Mr. Ellsworth's presence is no longer required at Blackmore. Not now, not ever, he said, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. He then turned his gaze to the magistrate, to the solicitors, to the entire silent watching room. His eyes found Verity's. Miss Verity has brought more honesty and light into this house in 1 month than it has seen in a decade, he declared, his voice thick with emotion. Her position here is not temporary. She will remain at Blackmore as my warda's companion, Anna as my future wife, if she will do me the honor. A collective gasp went through the room. Veritia's own breath caught in her throat. It was a proposal born of battle, a public claiming in the face of a vanquished enemy. It was mad. It was magnificent. She felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. They were all waiting for the poor relation, the grey mouse, to curtsy and accept her astonishing good fortune. But she looked from the magistrate to the defeated face of Ellsworth, and finally, to Crispin, whose heart was in his eyes, for all the world to see. She thought of the cold dismissal by the fireplace, and the long road from that moment to this. She had found her own footing in this house. She had earned her place. She lifted her chin. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent library. My place," she said, her hand tightening on Leo's. "Us, here." It was not the acceptance he had asked for. It was something more. A statement of fact. A claiming of her own. And in the Duca's eyes, she saw not disappointment, but a profound and boundless admiration. The battle was over. They had won. That night, the house was quiet. It was a new kind of quiet, not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief, but the peaceful, breathing silence of a home at rest. The solicitors were gone. Ellsworth was gone. Leo was asleep in his bed, the first truly peaceful sleep he had had in a year. Verity was in the library, standing by the fire, her mind a whirlwind. A duchess. He had called her his future wife in front of everyone. It felt like a dream, a fairy tale she had no right to be living. She heard him enter the room and turned. Crispin stood there, stripped of the armor of the Duke. He wore no jacket, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his face was etched with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low and raw. "A more than one." He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. That night, at the ball, when I said those words, I was a coward." He shook his head, a look of self-disgust on his face. "I saw you across the room. You were not like the others. You were not performing. You were still and real. And in that one glance, I felt something shift in this cold, dead house I carry inside me. It terrified me, so I said the cruelest, most dismissive thing I could think of. To push it away. To push you away." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding he did not deserve. It was a lie. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew it. "You are the only person I have seen clearly in years. And I have been looking for you. Looking for a way back to that first moment of clarity every day, since." Veritia's heart ached. She thought of all the lonely days, the quiet humiliations, the deep, abiding conviction of her own worthlessness. All of it, born of a frightened menace. "Lie my proposal today," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was clumsy, public. I put you on the spot. It was another ducal decree, and I am sorry for it. I was so afraid of losing you, of you thinking this was all just a position, that I tried to bind you to this place, to me, in the only way I knew how." He finally closed the distance between them, stopping just before her. The heat from the fire warmed her back, but the heat radiating from him was far more potent. "A Verity," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "Do not answer the Duke who made a public declaration. Answer the man who is standing before you now, the man who has been a fool and a coward, and who has been impossibly, terrifyingly lonely for a decade." Ah! She looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his confession there. But a lifetime of being merely useful had taught her to be cautious of fortune. "Do not say this if it is only gratitude," she whispered, the words costing her everything. "Do not ask me to be your wife because I helped you save Leo. I will not be a reward for a service rendered." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumb stroking her cheeks. His touch was electric, a current of pure feeling that melted the last of her defenses. "A gratitude," he murmured, a small sad smile touching his lips. Oh, Verity, I am grateful for what you did for Leo. But what I feel for you, it has nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the fact that this house is no longer cold when you are in it. That I am no longer cold when you are near. He searched her eyes. I am not asking you to be a duchess. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life looking at you. Truly looking. Will you let me do that? Tears she had refused to shed for 100 heartbreaks now welled in her eyes. She leaned into his touch, a surrender and a claiming all at once. Ah, yes, she breathed. Ah, yes, Crispin. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a duke's kiss practiced and polished. It was a manos kiss, clumsy and desperate, and full of a profound, soul-deep relief. It was the taste of home, of shelter from the storm, of a long winter, finally ending. It was the truth spoken at last in the quiet of the firelit library. 6 months later, Blackmore was a different house. The heavy curtains had been replaced with lighter ones that let the sunlight pour in. The sound of Leo's laughter echoed in the halls, often accompanied by the frantic barking of a terrier puppy Crispin had brought home for him. The pianoforte was open, and Verity, though she played poorly, would often pick out the simple melody of a rock of Agesa, with Leo humming along beside her. Leo's mother's paintings were hung throughout the house, her vibrant Amesia landscapes bringing life and color to the ancestral gloom. Her unfinished painting of the coast held a place of honor in the morning room, a testament not to what was lost, but to what was loved and remembered. Verity had found her place not as a duchess who gave orders, but as the steady, warm heart of the household. She managed the estate with Crispin, her sharp eye for numbers, and her innate compassion transforming Blackmore's relationship with the struggling village. The tenants, who had feared the cold duke, now loved the kind, sensible woman who listened to their troubles and made sure their roofs were mended. She was walking with Crispin in the newly tended gardens one late autumn afternoon. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Leo was running ahead, throwing a stick for the puppy. Crispin took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He had become a different man. The ice in his eyes had melted, leaving the warm, clear blue of a summer sky. He smiled more now, real smiles that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Do you ever think about that first night?" he asked quietly. Verity smiled a soft, secret smile. "I think about it sometimes. I remember a very grand, very foolish duke who said something utterly ridiculous." He winced, but the shame was gone, replaced by a fond self-reproach. I was a fool. Blinded by grief and fear, A stopped walking and turned to face her, pulling her close. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. You are worth every look, Verity. You are worth a lifetime of them." She looked up at him, at this man whose heart she had unlocked, whose home she had healed. She thought of the gray, invisible girl she had been, and the woman she was now, standing in the light of his love. She had not replaced the wife or the mother who had come before. She had not erased the grief. She had simply made room for new life to grow alongside it. She had done the one thing no one else had been able to do. She had stayed.